I know many of you know quite a bit about color. Some of you probably don't know very much. And so hitting sort of the general range is kind of my goal here. I'm going to kind of go through the presentation, and then hopefully there's a little bit of time afterwards I can ask some questions, and then after that, happy to go offline, or even after this event. You can email me, call me. We can talk about these things. Okay, so a little bit about me. Somebody made hats way back when. I have 2 complete degrees unrelated to color from the University of Colorado, and I'm actually quite proud of that. I was going to be a minerals landman and make my millions with oil and gas and mineral commodities rights. And that was back in 1983, and I looked out at the horizon and saw OPEC and the oil embargo. And I know there's enough people in this age range that are here that know what I'm talking about. It was a dire situation as a college student. So I said to myself real quickly, I need to focus on something else. So I added a finance degree. And it was true. I got out, and there were absolutely no jobs at Shell or Chevron or any of the geophysical companies that were doing exploration or minerals. Everything associated with oil and gas was down the tubes. So I landed in sales. I ended up realizing that I could sell, I could talk about things, and I kind of gravitated here and there. I fell into graphics in the Los Angeles area at the time when Macintoshes were very, very up and coming into our graphics and print and photographic markets. And incidentally, I found that kind of alluring, so I fell into that whole genre. And in the Los Angeles area, at that time, there were a lot of real cool innovations. Does anybody remember the term typesetter? Yeah. Oh my goodness, I'm well within good audience here then. So I installed a large number of paper and film typesetters. You may recall service bureaus were on practically every corner at one point. You could take your file and get it outputted. So I did a lot of that. I've been doing now that kind of work for over 28 years. And I've forgotten more than sometimes I remember. So, but it's all good. It's gotten me to the point of where I'm at now. I'm with a very good company called Chromix. In fact, my boss, Steve Upton, spoke here, I don't know how long ago, but several years ago. Does anybody remember Steve? Good, good. Karna raised her hand, I saw that. Steve is, he's one of the recognized gurus in the world regarding color. I am but a small candle to his large flame of color knowledge. But I've learned a few things, and I know a lot of very, very smart people, some of the smartest people in the world that work with color. So if I don't know the answer, which is very probable, I can generally find out the answer. Okay, so I've advised a lot of companies help improve their color efficiency, and also save a lot of money. A little bit about Chromix, the company I'm with now. We've done a lot of things. One of our notorieties is to make software that helps the industry, the color industry. Our software really is about color. ColorThink, our name tag is your brain on color, is a great software that does profile analysis and visualization. If you've ever been to a color management seminar, and you've seen a 2-dimensional or a 3-dimensional gamut displayed on screen, that's likely our software. It helps to basically provide that visualization for those relationships. And I'll show a little bit of ColorThink in my presentation here in a moment. We also make the prevalent G7 calibration software called Curve. We started out with the governing body called ID Alliance, GRACO, .org, and initiated this methodology for calibrating the grays in today's printing market. So I don't know how many people are familiar with G7, but I'll touch on that. G7 may not be in your wheelhouse necessarily, but it's going to be somewhere along the lines of the printing process. Mostly in North America, if you're not G7 calibrating your presses and your workflows, you're not a real significant player because it is a key success story. Helps to basically take the grays and smooth every other color out. Every other color is associated with gray. If you've got good grays, your colors are generally good. So we make the top calibration software for that. We also develop a cloud-based verification service called Maxwell. And many of you probably know Maxwell Clark. The name is actually derived from there. And it's basically, if you've got a printer or a press, you can feed measurement data in and get a verification of how well that press is. So we do a number of other things as well, as you imagine, with color. We make profiles, we provide monitors, and a lot of people ask me why we would provide a monitor. Well, the monitor in this graphic digital environment is really the viewer of our files these days. We're not dealing with film, and we're not dealing with chemicals, and we're not dealing with the kind of traditional legacy ways we used to view our images. We're dealing with them digitally, and the monitor is the key piece. So that is going to be one of my key sort of focuses in describing the keys to color. We also sell colorimeters, spectrophotometers, measuring devices. We sell profiling software, RIPs. Everybody knows what a RIP is. Raster image processor basically takes your graphic image and converts your text, your line art, your graphics into machine language, essentially. And we do a lot of consulting. So, caveats. I'm not a color scientist. But I'm not going to talk about color theory. I do love color. I think I was gravitated to this by something probably inane, but I loved color way back when it was mystical. When I was a young man out of college and looking for things to do, and I was kind of just dropped into the graphic markets, these color guys walked around like gods. They were cool. And some of them had long ponytails, but they were dealing with color, something real esoteric. And I thought, man, I want some of that. So I found myself gravitating more and more towards that. I'm not currently a field color consultant. I have done some. I've done a variety of different consulting. My role mostly these days is to help drive our business. But I work with a large number of field consultants and color experts that I put and employ into our projects. And I help coordinate those customers. And I'm working with small mom and pop type customers all the way up to Fortune 50 type companies with helping them color. I'm also not a Photoshop or Lightroom expert, sad to say. But I do know enough of it, and I can speak well enough about these key pieces in a color workflow. And as most of you already know, color is not easy. I'm not going to tell you it is. Color is one of those weird professions where you can read volumes of information about it, walk away, and not know either what you just read or beat your head against the wall because it's not working. Color's got a lot of idiosyncrasies, a lot of variables, but there's hope. There's hope because once you get one key piece, and I'm hoping to convey that one key piece might be gray balancing. You get that one key piece, a lot of the rest of color tends to fall in place. Excuse me. So a few key points, and I'm going to talk about color management just from a very generalized. I don't know how much of you know color management, but I'm going to kind of hit the key points. And I'm from Tim's talk, I'm fairly convinced many of you probably have some pretty good knowledge about how it relates to a photographic workflow. How many of you are in a CMYK printing realm with your work? Do any of you do press checks anymore? Okay, so you're handing off CMYK files. Okay, so most of you are RGB, I'm guessing, correct? Okay, that's cool. That's cool. It's still, color is very, very important. And those are two distinctly different kind of workflows as well, and I'll talk about each. So the variables are pretty obvious. Obviously, that the human viewer is going to be one of your top variables. And, you know, how much coffee have you had this morning? How much did you have to drink last night? These are all things that affect our human perception of that color. Lighting, as any photographer knows, is a key factor in the color that's viewed and perceived and reproduced. Ambient viewing condition. This darker environment is great, but it's going to be a whole different world than a designer who's got bay windows and skylights in front of the monitor. They're going to see different colors. obviously. So equipment is a factor, software is a factor, skill level is a factor, and many, many other things. So our goal, your goal, is to reduce or eliminate these variables. It's like any standard operating procedure. You reduce the variables and you lock it down into what works, and you repeat that day in, day out. And so that's what we advocate. And then someone has to be motivated enough to commit to that process and to repeat that and to be responsible for that. Color is a pretty important thing. If you're a printer for Nike, one of our local companies here, and I work with many of these, if you don't get Nike red correct, you will pay a fee. You'll get charged back. It's very, very important to get your colors right. RGB and CMYK are very different, and obviously they're different processes. RGB is a much more vivid type of color space and color generally. It's an additive type of color. You're basically adding red, green, blue, and if you do 100% of all of those, you're getting white. That additive process gives you variations of color along that scale. CMYK, exactly the opposite. It's a subtractive process. The more ink you add, the darker it gets, to the point that it's muddy brown and then eventually dark if you're adding all inks. I talk about CMYK, but these days CMYK, the printing process, truly is more than just CMYK. There's many, many other colors that are added on top of or in adjacent to CMYK. Orange, green, purple, violet, spot colors, name colors, you name it. But I talk about CMYK as sort of, that's the basis of what most printing technology is based on. And a representation of color think. This kind of shows roughly the inside here. Gamut shows an sRGB space versus the Adobe RGB space. And many of you are probably working with those spaces, or maybe even larger spaces like ProPhoto. And there's reasons and advantages to kind of know this, and especially, I'm going to hope this is actually, yay! So this is in our software called ColorThink. What ColorThink allows you to do is to see that two-dimensionally. You see the bottom part of the grid there shows you, but there's a lot going on here three-dimensionally that you need to deal with as far as your color, and it has to do with dealing with getting that color back into a usable space that works for whatever the workflow and outcome is. And so our software kind of helps with this kind of relationship. There we go. So I got this off the internet, and I don't know how well you can read that or not. It's not very clear to me, so it's probably not clear to you. But what's cool about this particular graphic is that it shows a CMYK gamut. It also shows sRGB gamut. It shows an Adobe RGB gamut, and then it shows the ProPhoto wide gamut. Then it shows the visible gamut, roughly, as far as human visual spectrum is concerned. There's a big difference there. It's nice to be able to be at the top of the pyramid in that sense, but at the same time, we do have to work with those colors with the devices that are prevalent today. This is a good graphic, again off the internet. What I liked about this one is that you can have a much smaller print space, CMYK space, for example, that doesn't match up with a much larger monitor or RGB space, camera space, for example. So how do you deal with that? These colors right here are not going to fit within the realm of that output device. So there are techniques that allow you to do what we call mapping of those adverse colors into a usable device space. One of those is a profile. Profile, everybody's heard the term a profile, an ICC profile? Good, good. Hopefully, if you haven't, let me explain it. Long time ago, back in the 30s, a group of scientists decided to measure the human visual spectrum and record it and quantify it to some degree, as best as they could with the technology they had. And that's where they came about with this information and the ability to transform color from device space to device space using the basis of this. So what an ICC profile is essentially a unique descriptor of a unique printer, paper, and ink. So you change the ink, you've got another profile. Various papers, you're going to have a profile for each one, ideally. Okay, so I'm going to talk about profiles because they're a key piece in color management. Doesn't mean you have to use a profile, but in the case of most photography, you're going to be using profiles. Some printing these days doesn't really require it. How do you make a profile? Basically, you're measuring color with a device, and you're recording that information. That information gets compared against what that color actually is versus what your device represents. And so that difference is then calculated to create not only a body of information of what's available or capable of your device, but also a compensation set that helps to get to a certain color definition. So one of my main points that I like to convey is that in a profile, there are two sides. There's an input side, there's an output side. Almost all profiles, except for input profiles, have this relationship. It's very, very important to understand that. Think of Microsoft Excel. You've got measurement data filling this table, this lookup table. And I like to say the word LUT because people look at me and go, and then I go, lookup table, and they go, oh, yeah. So the two sides of a profile actually interrelate all the time in your workflow. So let's talk about an RGB workflow. Here is kind of a typical workflow. You take an image, it could be a scanner as well. This is a unidirectional flow into your viewing space. So however you're capturing that RGB information, it's eventually going to get converted unidirectionally via a profile, the profile that defines how it comes into your viewing and monitor space. So once you've got your information into your viewing space, you're working on it, I assume, in Photoshop or Lightroom, and it seems that my labels have kind of gone away, but oh well. Nonetheless, so you're viewing this again on a calibrated profiled monitor. And what I mean by a calibrated profiled monitor is that you've set 3 calibration criteria: your white point, your gamma, and your luminance. Those are the 3 parameters for calibrating a monitor. And the reason you calibrate a monitor is like anything else. You want to have controlled repeatability of a specific narrow range of optimal functionality. That was a lot of big words, and I'm sorry about that. But the reality is that most all of you are probably calibrating your monitors if you're photography. There's 2 ways to really kind of look at monitor calibration. I'll talk a little bit later about some of my favorite type of monitor technology. But typically your standard monitor, you're going to be calibrating the gamma curves on your video card. And that's fine. That's how things have been kind of done if you're on a Mac or Windows. If you're on Linux or Unix or any other flavor like that, you're not doing it that way. But the idea is that you're calibrating that information. It's stored in what's called LUT memory on your video card. The problem with that kind of calibration is that this calibration data is sitting on a video card in a computer next to a hard drive, and as it's pulled through the video cable to the rendering process of the monitor, it gets corrupted in various and sundry ways. So that noise, that information that does eventually get rendered is okay, but oftentimes it's not. The other kind of monitor is with a product like an AZO or an NEC, where you've got, and they actually call those a color critical class of monitors, where you're calibrating the internal graphics of the monitor, you're communicating with that monitor, and you're actually storing your calibration data in the monitor's LUT memory. And so the benefits of that are that you've got a quieter, cleaner source of where that calibration information is coming from, and it's sampled at a higher bit depth than you would ever get from your video card. So I'm a very strong advocate of color critical level monitors. Not to deviate too far, but so the monitor is a key piece in this whole transformation. So when you go to print, you're going to basically, and I know that right in the middle here, I'm not showing this, but in the middle, you've got your operating system, the CMM, the color management module that basically does your interpretation and transformation. as well as your Adobe or Quark or Corel apps as well. There's an intercommunication. I'm not showing that. Really what I wanted to show is the relationship of the profiles, the input and output side. So you go to print. You're basically essentially converting your image through the output side of your monitor profile to the input side of your printer profile through your operating system and such. Okay? So this transformation is called the print path. We call that the B to A. B to A print path. Why? That sounds kind of bass-ackwards. But it is, in fact, using that set of tables. Okay? Generally, if you've got a good calibrated, good profiled monitor, and you've got a good printer, and typically in a photographic workflow, you're talking Epson, Canon, HP, that kind of inkjet printer, typically also driving it through the print driver. You've got a good profile of that good device, you're going to get good output. Granted, there's another factor here that I should mention. It's the settings in your Photoshop, your Lightroom, or whatever that application is. Photoshop and Lightroom I advocate strongly because those are the two best color management friendly applications anywhere, especially for RGB photographic, Photoshop-centric type workflows. So they are great. They handle ICC profiles. The problem is you can't turn color management off anymore. It's on, whether you want it or not, whether you're managing color or not. So you kind of have to deal with it one way or another. So your print path, your B to A print path, okay? Generally, you're going to get a good output if you've followed all the steps and covered your bases and made sure that this is quality. Now, how many have heard the term soft proofing? How many have used soft proof? Okay, quite a few. Good, good. Soft proofing is wonderful, especially for a RGB photographic workflow. And that's the reason also why I like Photoshop and Lightroom, because they accommodate this back side to the color management workflow. They allow the accommodation of converting that image information from your printer space back to your monitor space. In fact, literally turning your monitor into an output device, simulating your printer. So what's cool about this is that now you really truly, if you're doing this through profiles, accurate profiles of your devices, you're literally simulating what's going to happen here. Think of the paper, the time, the ink savings. Anybody had to buy Epson ink lately? Yeah. Cheap, huh? Well, yeah, and in fact you can buy third-party inks that are in big bins now because of the expense. It's pretty significant. But the beauty of it is that it's a very, very good way to get a rendition of your image on screen, simulating this environment, this print environment. If you don't soft proof now, I strongly advocate checking into it because you've already probably got the tools with your Lightroom and Photoshop. It's very capable. Okay. Let me think if there's anything else I have forgotten here. Did I mention I'm not very funny? Well, I take that back. I do know quite a few color management jokes, but I can't really repeat them here. They're a little bit colorful. That's bad. You know, I was skipping over a lot of information. Back to profiles. One of the ways that we gauge how good something is basically a factor of perfection versus not. And in fact, the word perfection in our industry is something we avoid like the plague. We don't use the word perfect. But it's obvious that, you know, when a customer's happy, it's perfect. Okay, but in our world, delta E of 0 is perfection. That's very, very difficult to reach. It's good to at least know where it's at. So we use a couple of different parameters for deciding how close we are to that perfection. Delta E 76, Delta E 2000. We just call it Delta E depending on the environment you're in. Generally with most devices, if you're in a 1 to 3 Delta E, you're good. If you're generally above a 9, you're not so good. However, you know, some printing presses are just fine at printing over Delta E of 15. You know, you could be printing on a corrugated cardboard and it doesn't really matter so much as long as it's a shade of green or whatever. So that's one method that we use to kind of clarify how close the color is. Another one is something actually we started doing many years ago in ColorThink. We decided that we could calculate how much gamut volume is associated with a unique device and its ink and paper or characteristics. And we came up with a term called gamut volume. And so consequently, a lot of other people started using this factor as well. The bigger your gamut volume, presumably, the more color you've got. And so a lot of paper suppliers, a lot of ink suppliers, maybe monitor I know NEC and AZO do use the gamut volume comparison from time to time to give credence to their products. Tools, pretty straightforward. With a monitor, you're going to use a colorimeter, typically. Couple $100 product. If you don't have one, I strongly recommend getting one. The X-Rite i1 display is probably the most prevalent colorimeter. Comes with a piece of software, Mac and Windows, that basically allows you to measure color stimulus on screen, takes that information, uses it for a calibration, and then it stores it into an ICC profile. Spectrophotometers, and this is probably the world's most prevalent, is a handheld one called an i1 Pro. It's also made from X-Rite. And it measures the reflective information, typically from your targets, your print targets. And targets are what we use to basically measure what an output performance of a device is. There's many different kinds of spectrophotometers. Don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this particular device takes the i1 and puts it in a robotic armature and allows you to automate the reading of that particular target. It's kind of cool. And there's a lot of devices that are kind of like a scanner. You just feed a sheet in and it reads everything in a very quick manner. Standards. Have any of you ever heard the term Grackle? Grackle? Swap? Swap? Yeah. Ah, okay. Well, many years ago, swap was kind of what people used to kind of target their printing material and process. Since that time, though, many other good and better standards have come about. Grackle, for example, is a very good example. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily use a profile. When we're talking about the printing process, it could be about targeting something that the industry accepts as a acceptable standard. And so the whole idea of a G7 is basically, it's that methodology of calibrating the grays, the neutral point density curve of that printing device. If you can hit the range of colors through that calibration, you're going to have a pretty good chance of hitting the projects for Procter & Gamble or Coca-Cola or whoever. So these right here are standards. Grackle, coded 1, coded 3, 5, swap, etc. These are basically based on press runs that define how well and the tolerances they hit those grays. And then through that process, there's a verification side of it as well. I don't know if many of you have seen this. This is an ISO verification strip, 12647-7. It's what you'll see on the side of a press or a proofer. And you measure it, and it tells you how far off you are. It gives you a pass-fail, and it'll tell you where you're needing to go if you do need correction. Okay? So although many of you aren't necessarily in the print realm, this is something that is used prevalent day to day, everywhere mostly. Okay, and I've kind of talked about this. I was wondering why I didn't get my titles there. Okay, like that. Things do break. I'm kind of jumping around now a little bit, but things do break. And in our experience, with a photographic workflow, the biggest single place that they break is that communication point between the conversion from your viewing space to your printer space. There's only really 3 things that could possibly happen here. One, you've either got a bad profile or a bad monitor, and it's very possible your monitor is too old. Maybe the luminance has gotten down to a point where it won't have any more light or enough light to be able to represent the colors. Or it's out of balance. The other is basically you might have a bad printer. You might have some bad print heads. Maybe the nozzles are clogged. Maybe the alignment is off. Whatever the case, that's a maintenance issue. Or the profile representing that is bad. Or it could be a bad setting in your Photoshop or Lightroom. So it's going to be one of those 3 kinds of things. It's a matter of troubleshooting that. We tend to start with the most obvious kind of problem and work our way backwards to the least obvious. And through that whole process, troubleshooting process, we're going to basically trip over or discover what that problem is. Okay. Again, more of that. So CMYK workflow, similar in many ways, but also adding this extra dimension of a press adds an order of complexity that's unbelievable. So no longer are we printing directly to a device. We may print directly to a proofer, but this proofer is no longer an inkjet. It's an inkjet that has a rip on it. And so that rip process takes that file, converts it into machine language, simulates the press at the same time, and it's all doing it via the profiles. The better your press and maintained it is, the more that profile is intrinsic or represents the press, the more simulation, the better simulation you're going to get through this entire workflow. Many things can break. And now we're talking also about a variety of different applications, like InDesign, Illustrator, QuarkXPress, CorelDRAW. There's a variety of them. And things break. Okay, so kind of getting to my keys now. Probably one of the biggest qualifier is that there is a desire for color fidelity. If you don't have a desire for color fidelity, you're passing that off to someone else, you're passing that somewhere else, and you're paying for that responsibility, or it's not yours and you don't care, this isn't going to be that relevant for you. On the other hand, if you do have some amount of responsibility for your color, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Being a color geek, color is a great thing if it works right. So I'm going to kind of go back to my mantra. Use an ICC profile or a suitable standard. If you've got a printer and they're providing you their standard, yeah, we're hitting Grackle coded 1. Use that. Use that in your simulation of your workflow. Okay. Key number 2, basically use a color critical monitor. Calibrate it and profile it on a regular basis. The reality is that even with the top monitors that are out there, like an AZO, for example, you still should calibrate it once a month. You could get away without 3 or 4 months worth of calibration on a monitor of that level. The reality is we as humans, we tend to forget after about 60 days or 45 days even. And once you fall out of calibration, your color also will tend to kind of slide or slip just a little bit. So again, kind of reiterating the kind of workflow and the necessity to kind of keep things tuned and maintained. A standard operating procedure is a very good thing if you want to go there. So the top 2 monitors in graphics, and I'm not talking medical grade or anything like that, but I'm talking about in graphics for photography and print, are basically the AZO and the NEC. These two have a huge advantage over most of the rest of the field in that it's a higher quality, the components, the backlight, and on the construction and the engineering is superior. Now, I tend to kind of prefer AZO. Nobody masters the grays better than AZO. AZO kind of set the industry standard as far as how well your grays get balanced on monitor. They're wonderful. They used to be very expensive. The reality is AZOs now and NECs are priced very comparably. AZO is still a step up, but NEC's done a very good job. They outsell AZO 10 to 1. They're just a much bigger company. They do a lot more things than what AZO does. And I don't mean to bash HP, Dell, Samsung, LG, any of those. So sorry if I do. You can calibrate these other kinds of monitors, but you're not going to get quite the intimate kind of calibration you'll get from a monitor like this. Okay? Now, I've talked about gray balance. I'm going to show you some gray balance tools that many of you could probably use right now, both on your monitor and in your print. Okay, so there's 2 kind of aspects to gray. Gray balance, which essentially is how well balanced your grays are. How gray, how neutral is this ramp from black to white? If you see coloration, you know, pinks and blues and greens, that's not really good gray balance. Or you may have good gray balance in certain sections, but not in others. You want a very neutral gray ramp. Separation, a little different, and separation tells us how well maybe your video card, your graphics, and the profile are separating out each and every step. This is a fairly small ramp right here. It's about 25 steps. Ideally, if you could create one in Photoshop from black to white in 1% or 1 degree steps, and you can place this around your monitor in 5 different steps. 5 different areas. These are the kind of the most common regions we view our images. Most people tend to view their images in the center, but there's a big difference between what the geography, the region in the center is versus your corners and edges. And so this test will show you how well each region of your monitor is doing. If you're questioning how good your monitor is, I'll send this gray ramp to you. You'll have to mask it out and then just put it in these 5 different spots with a gray background, and then look for both the gray balance and the gray separation. You'll see right up here, this is a projection system. It's not going to be perfect, but you'll already see some of the idiosyncrasies that are just in this region of the screen right here. I tend to also kind of not prefer a real dark gray background. Cave black is not necessarily in the best environment for human eyes. There's sort of a myopia associated with having too little light. Our eyes and our brains tend to do certain things, but not too bright either. So we tend to, in our industry, to kind of talk about sort of a neutral gray, an 18% neutral gray type of background. So if you can come into the range with a reasonable gray, you'll have a lot better performance in kind of gauging these zones. Make notes. You know, you may find that the upper left-hand corner is plugging up the shadows, yet the lower right-hand corner may be washing out your highlights. Just make notes. And so if you're going to continue using that monitor, note where the best places are to view your images at. Ideally, you're going to be calibrating and profiling that monitor, and maybe even ideally, you'll at some point want to get a step up to a better monitor that has a little bit better performance. And that's pretty much it. I'd like to open up to any questions if we have any.
Questions?
Sure.